Welcome back to Movie Explained in English. Today I'm going to show you a 2006 biographical drama film called The Pursuit of Happyness. Spoilers ahead. Sit back, relax and enjoy. The film opens in San Francisco in 1981. The main character, Chris Gardner, sells a medical device for a living. As part of his daily routine, he drops off his son, Christopher, at daycare and then heads to various hospitals that might need what he's selling. Chris narrates that he needs to sell at least one device a month to get by, but almost every hospital sees the device as expensive and unnecessary. Because of this, he has to ask his wife Linda to pick up their son from daycare, even though Linda is working a double shift. That night, while having dinner, Chris sees a Rubik's Cube, which is still a new toy at the time. Linda asks him if he has paid the taxes, and Chris tells her he needs to file for another extension, making Linda more stressed before she goes back to work. After Linda leaves, Chris tries to solve the Rubik's Cube but finds it reasonably easy. The following day, while walking down the street, he sees a businessman with a nice car. Chris asks the man what he does for a living, and the man tells him he's a stockbroker. When Chris comments that the job requires a high level of education, the man responds that it's not necessary. One only needs to rely on math and social skills. After this brief interaction, Chris reflects on how happy the people around him are, wondering why he can't be like them. The next morning, Chris tells Linda that he plans to apply for a stockbroker position. Linda thinks it's ridiculous, which Chris does not appreciate. They argue, and Linda reminds Chris that they have 2 months' rent to pay. After their argument, Chris heads to a brokerage firm to apply for the job. He leaves his medical device with a street performer because he doesn't want to go inside carrying it. Chris calls this part of his life stupid. While he's applying for the job, he sees the street performer running away with the device, prompting Chris to quickly leave while carrying the application form. Unfortunately, the street performer manages to escape by train. The following day, Chris promises Linda that he will sell the device so they won't have to see it anymore. He then brings Christopher to daycare and tells him that the word happiness doesn't have a Y in it, contrary to what is painted on the daycare walls. He shares a story with his son about his nickname, 10-gallon head, because he's from Texas, where they wear large cowboy hats. Afterward, Chris heads to Dean Witter Reynolds with a filled-out application form, personally delivering it to the resource head, Jay Twistle. However, their interaction is brief because Jay is in a hurry. After dropping off the application form, Chris spots the street performer with his stolen device and angrily chases after him, narrating that he has spent his entire life savings on it, so losing it is worth a month's groceries. After a chase, he finally retrieves his device, but now he has 2, which is a far cry from his earlier promise to get rid of it. Later that day, Linda discovers the 2 devices and is thoroughly disappointed. After giving Christopher a basketball for his birthday, Chris tries to explain what happened earlier, but Linda doesn't want to hear it. In the next scene, Chris talks to Jay while hailing a taxi. He mentions the application form he submitted a month ago, but Jay tells him he has to go somewhere. Chris seizes the opportunity to talk to Jay, claiming he's headed to the same place. They both end up in the same taxi. Inside the taxi, Jay focuses on solving the Rubik's Cube, while Chris talks about his skills and personality. Noticing this, Chris asks to solve the cube, and Jay doubts him. However, Chris impressively finishes the cube just before Jay drops off. But Jay leaves Chris behind, meaning Chris has to pay the fare. Stopping at a stoplight, Chris makes a run for it and successfully escapes via train, but he leaves behind his device when the train door closes on his hand. That day, Chris calls Linda to apologize for not being on time. Furious that she missed her shift, Linda tells Chris she and Christopher are leaving. Chris returns home to find his wife and son gone. Just then, he receives a call from Jay, telling him to write down his secretary's number so they can talk tomorrow. With no pen or paper nearby, Chris has to memorize the numbers and rush to a nearby store to write them down. The following day, Chris confronts Linda, who has just dropped off their son at daycare. After Linda tells Chris she's not happy anymore, he reluctantly allows her to leave, but insists that she cannot take their son. Later that day, Chris brings Christopher home. That night, the landlord asks Chris for rent, but Chris pleads with him to allow him to stay a little longer. The landlord agrees to give him 10 more days, provided Chris paints the rooms himself. The next day, while painting the walls white, there's a knock at the door. When Chris opens it, he sees 2 policemen who inform him that he must accompany them to the station. At the police station, Chris pays for a parking ticket, but the officer tells him it will be verified at 9:30 in the morning. With no other choice, Chris calls Linda to ask her to take care of their son while he's gone. Linda accepts, but only on the condition that she'll return their son late. Consequently, Chris has to spend the night at the station. The following day, Chris rushes to his interview at Dean Witter. Since he doesn't have time to change, he goes there still wearing the same clothes from the previous day. Upon arrival, Chris notices the panel's disappointment. He candidly explains that he was arrested the day before for failing to pay parking tickets. As the interview progresses, Mr. Frome seems unimpressed, but by the end, Chris manages to make the panel laugh. Afterward, Jay congratulates Chris on successfully interviewing without formal attire, but Chris tells him he'll think about the job since he learns there's an internship period with no pay. Jay encourages him to consider it. After the interview, Chris heads straight home, waiting for Linda and Christopher to return. Linda arrives with Christopher a little later. That night, while Christopher is asleep, Linda tells Chris she's heading to New York to work as a waitress. Chris agrees, but only if their son stays with him. Linda believes Chris can take care of their son and tearfully leaves them for good. The following day, Chris and Christopher move 2 blocks down to a nearby motel with the help of Chris's friend. Since it's Saturday, Chris invites his son to play basketball. While shooting the ball, Christopher expresses his dream of going pro. However, Chris discourages him, suggesting he might not have a chance and advising him to stop aiming for such a goal. Chris notices a change in his son's attitude as a result of his words. Seeing the impact of his earlier words, Chris encourages his son not to let others, especially him, tell him he can't achieve something. They then head to a hospital to sell their medical device, and the hospital agrees to buy it, providing the father and son with some much-needed money. The following day, Chris attends his internship to learn about the trade. During a lunch break, he unexpectedly runs into Mr. Frome on the street. However, their conversation is abruptly cut short when Chris spots the device he left behind during his earlier escape from the taxi. He chases after the man carrying it, but is unable to catch up because he gets hit by a car. Though he manages to stand, Chris realizes he has lost a shoe and returns to the program with 1 shoe missing. Afterward, the film shows various scenes of Chris being ordered around to run errands. In the next scene, Chris struggles to find success with the names written on his cheeks. He decides to approach the company's CEO in hopes of making a connection and is fortunate enough to get the chance to meet him. As Chris rushes out of the building, Mr. Frome stops him to park his car, causing Chris to miss his meeting. That night, while eating at a diner, Chris tells his son he needs his help for a trip. He convinces Christopher to join him by mentioning they might go to a football game. The following morning, Chris visits the house of the CEO he had contacted earlier, Mr. Ribbon. He thanks Mr. Ribbon for the opportunity from the day before, even though he missed it. Mr. Ribbon then invites Chris and Christopher to join him, as Chris had mentioned they were going to the football game. Seeing this as a valuable opportunity, Chris and Christopher go with Mr. Ribbon and his son. During the game, Mr. Ribbon tells Chris that while he likes him, there's no chance he will accept his offer. The upside is that Chris gets the chance to talk with Mr. Ribbon and his businessman friends. While things seem to be going well, everything changes when the IRS seizes money from Chris's bank account to cover his unpaid taxes, leaving him broke. In a desperate attempt to make some money, Chris asks a friend for the funds he owes him, but his friend believes it has already been paid. Frustrated, Chris prompts his friend to close the door on him. Later that day, Chris finally retrieves the device he had left behind earlier. They rush from place to sell it, only to find out it's broken. Although the hospital will still pay for it once it's fixed, Chris feels overwhelmed and distressed. That night, Chris and Christopher have nowhere to sleep, so they spend the night at a subway station. While Chris tries to get some sleep, Christopher keeps waking him up, highlighting the challenges they face. The following day, Chris gets back to work, hoping to sell the device after he fixes it. He also brings some homemade lunches to avoid spending money. However, everything takes a turn when he receives a call from his friend, who informs him that he has lost his job at the office. Despite the setbacks, Chris continues to give it his all at the internship. When he finally hears that Jay wants to see him, excitement courses through him as he rushes to the office. Jay delivers the fantastic news. Chris has landed a position at the firm. Thrilled, Chris learns that he will be a stockbroker. As the movie concludes, Chris and Christopher walk together to their new home, no longer burdened by their previous struggles and ready to face the world together. If you enjoyed this summary and want to see more movie explanations, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Movie Explained in English for more. Your support helps us bring you more content like this. Thanks for watching and see you next time.